Our guest today has a truly inspirational, transformational weight loss story. About 5 years ago, Tom Watson lost 8 stone, that's 112 pounds or 51 kilos, and reversed his type 2 diabetes by committing to a whole new way of life. And we are so excited that decluttering played a part in his journey. Tom is a Declutter Hub Podcast super fan, and this is one you're not going to want to miss.
You're listening to the Declutter Hub Podcast, bringing you tried and tested, no-nonsense tips and advice from the leading experts in decluttering and organising your home. Now here's your host, Leslie Spellman.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 196. I'm Leslie. If you're new to the Declutter Hub podcast, you are so welcome. What you'll find here is reality, empathy, and advice by the bucket load. Some of you will binge the podcast and others will take your time. But our aim is that you learn, be motivated, and be excited to start or continue your decluttering journey with our little podcast in your ear along the way. Now, today's podcast is a little bit different. We have a truly inspirational guest. I'm very, very excited. And I'd like to explain a little bit about how he came to be on our radar. Now, back in March 2020, and March 2020 meant a lot of things to a lot of people, but I was out with friends and it was the last night before the UK went into full lockdown. So that's why I remember it so well. So I'm out sitting there for dinner with friends. I know I shouldn't have been on my phone, but I was. And I got a tweet from someone. And it was a man. And he said, do you know what, Leslie, Ingrid, I love your podcast. And so it really piqued my interest because it was a man. Does that sound really bad that it's a man? But, you know, men are not that common in our world, sadly. They are, but they don't always go public. So I noticed it, started to look at his profile and realized that he was a public figure. And so it kind of went into my radar. 2 years went by. And then about kind of 6 months ago, we had a podcast review by the same person, Tom Watson. And I was like, he really is a super fan. I need to get hold of him and get him to come on our podcast. And so here he is. So welcome, Tom.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for the opener. That's very kind of you.
No, you're welcome. I was just like Googling you, kind of stalking you basically while I was out for dinner. I'm like, oh, this is a guy. Tell us a little bit about your background, Tom. Put a little bit of context. So you're not just a man. Well, you are kind of just a man, but you have things. You've got a great career. Tell us a little bit about that.
I guess really I'm most known publicly. I'm a recovering politician. I was an MP in the UK Parliament for 20 years. I was the deputy leader of the Labour Party for 4 or 5 years of that. That was the opposition party. But during that time and since then, I've published 3 best-selling books, made some television, including Rowing the Length of Britain in a rowing boat, which was fun. And one of my books is about a health journey I went on where I lost a lot of weight, 8 stones in weight, and reversed type 2 diabetes, which for me was a life-changing experience and probably set a train of things in motion that meant that I left politics and had a quieter, calmer, more restful, satisfying, energetic life in my mid-50s.
That's a great synopsis. That's fantastic. I think it was that transformational weight loss that really was interesting to me because right back in the day when I started with the Clutter Fairy or my one-to-one professional organising business, one of the very first things that I wrote was the comparisons between weight loss and clutter, because it's the same. So the emotions that you feel are very, very similar. And that's a lot of what we want to talk about today, the comparison between the two and how they are completely similar. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. When I read your first book, so your first book that you spoke about there was called Downsizing, fantastic book, all about your own personal journey with weight loss and health mainly. The health is a big part. Yes, you lost the weight, which is obviously an important part of that, but it's really the reversing of the diabetes and this new kind of sense of having a healthy lifestyle and a kind of simpler lifestyle that ensued after that. And so there are so many emotions that are similar with weight loss, and that's what I want to talk about today. Just read your other book, which we'll talk about later as well, which is another one which is also fantastic. But I think let's talk about some of those key emotions. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was shame. You talked a lot about shame when you were overweight. So talk about that, and how do you think that relates to decluttering?
Okay, for me, I mean, there's lots of complications to do with decluttering and weight loss, and I'm still working some of it out. But the shame element for me, when I wrote the book, I thought I need to really highlight some of the really humiliating moments in my sort of journey to put the weight on. In a funny sort of way, it's an everyman story. I started piling pounds on in my 20s, and every so often would join a gym, and it would last a week, and I'd fail on another fad diet, to the point where in my late 40s I was 22 stones, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and in quite a bad physical condition. And there's plenty of warning signs along the way that you immediately deny, but the moments of shame are really deep. And the two for me, I remember once I was a defence minister, and on my first day of reporting to the Ministry of Defence, there's obviously a lot of security. And they've kind of got those tube security things where you walk in one side and the door closes and then it opens up and you're in the building. Well, I got in the tube and set all the alarms off because I'd triggered the maximum weight limit, and I think they thought 2 people were being smuggled into this top security building, which caused me great humiliation, as you can imagine. And then the other one for me is just sort of this idea of unconscious eating, where I'm sitting in a cafe in Manchester, and my friend comes in to meet me a bit late. And I'd got the sort of fork in my hand and I was leaning onto the next table, eating some leftover cake that previous customer had left. And I had no comprehension of doing that. And those little moments, they're even more shameful when you're healthy. You look back and think, how did I get into a position where I did things like that, or I allowed myself to be in a position where that happened? And then there's sort of, there's almost a Premier League of shame. I always remember, being on the front bench in the House of Commons when the then Health Secretary announced the National Obesity Strategy, and I was sort of trying to work my way to the furthest end of the bench because all the MPs opposite were sort of pointing at me, and all little things like that sort of add up to make it, it's sometimes quite overpowering emotions, really, which aren't good when you're in your middle years.
And I think when you do feel that shame, of course, you feel judged. So did you feel, you talked about little things along the way, little kind of warning signs, things that people were saying. Do you felt that you just chose to ignore those and were a little bit in denial, or?
I was definitely in denial. Even when I had a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, it was very shaming to get the diagnosis, but I didn't tell anyone about it for quite a while. And I wouldn't allow myself to think very deeply about what I had to do to put it right. And that denial, I think, is, because you need to almost deconstruct what's gone on at a very elemental level before you can get well again. And that's the same with decluttering. I'm sure we'll get onto that. But where, for me, it was like a tiny little whisper in my inner thoughts that turned into a really loud shout over a number of years. And, the voice said, you're going to die if you don't sort this out. And, I've got 2 kids. I love them very much. And in the end, my health was so bad that I thought, okay, I've actually got to, completely prioritize getting healthy. But it took me many, many years to get there. And, a number of years from diagnosis to actually dealing with it, because you have to commit, and you have to really commit at a fundamental level.
Yeah, I think that the nice thing for us, actually, as declutterers, whether that's when we're working one-to-one with people or whether we're working with people in our sort of Declutter Hub communities, is that we tend to hit people at that rock bottom level. And I think people have to hit that sometimes to be able to go on that upwards trajectory from there. And so it's important to understand what's gone before. But the nice thing for us is people are committed, because it's like, enough is enough. I have to do something about this. And sometimes that can take a little while to get off the starting blocks. It's not always like, okay, I'm going to do this today and off we go. It takes a while to gather momentum and to get on that upwards trajectory that's going to continue to go up. Of course it does. But you do have to hit that rock bottom sometimes for the warning, because those signs are there, and they're there with decluttering as well. You know, people, you stop letting people in your house, or you can't sort of make excuses, or, you know, people are constantly saying to you things about shopping, but you're like, oh, you know, and trying to make light of it. And so it's very similar. I mean, perhaps the shame is perhaps a little, you can be a bit more secret if it's clutter in your house, but, you know, if it's weight, it's there for all to see. But the diabetes is a really interesting one, because that's where, you know, people judge you for having diabetes and almost think that it's something that you bring on yourself. I don't think that, obviously, but a lot of people do. And that's the thing, people, well, you brought that on yourself by overeating or whatever, don't they? Is that something that you felt?
Yeah, in a sense, I did bring it on myself, because I'd not addressed underlying issues with nutrition and different kinds of movement. Although I don't want this to be all about the individual. I've sort of had rows with big TV presenters like Piers Morgan about this, who says it's down to personal discipline and you just have to sort of commit. And how I describe it, it's like the system is stacked against people. You know, you go into a supermarket, there's marketing campaigns, there's glossy packaging, there's 2-for-1 offers, there's hidden ingredients in food, there's massive advertising, there's, you know, kids start off at school with really sort of heavily branded sugary products. So it's like you're almost set up to fail on these health journeys. And it's only when you kind of get beyond all of that, you work all that out and you realise, you know, if you're going to do this right, you're never going to eat a chocolate hobnob ever again. It's at that kind of primitive elemental level that you have to go. And of course, that's really hard for people to do, isn't it? Because, you know, you've got all these temptations all around you all the time.
You know what, you're absolutely right. And it's all about shifting these emotions and habits that we've had for years. And I'm very, very aware of them. But I went out for dinner with friends on Saturday night, the same friends actually that I was out with before lockdown. And we're like, oh, let's go somewhere different. And we went to an all-you-can-eat cheese fondue, which sounded quite nice, and all you can drink. And there's something about that where you've prepaid for something, which means that you will overindulge in a way that you wouldn't ordinarily. Ordinarily you would stop, but you want to get your money's worth. And these are hard habits to break. And, you know, I came away on Sunday and thought, why did I do that? Why did I then ask for more wine when I wouldn't have done that ordinarily on a night out? There's something psychological, because these big marketing brains are there tempting you, as you say, along the way, whether it's food, whether it's shopping, whether it's 2-for-1s, whether it's buy 2 things and get something free, exactly the same principles.
Yeah, when I looked at the science of it, I mean, there is actually, nutritional science is arguably the most over-influenced by private funding of any of the sort of sciences. And they've got this thing called the bliss spot, where they literally wire your head to look at the brain and work out the balance between fat, sugar and salt that lights your brain up. And the goal is to sort of get your mouth salivated, get a sweet sensation that's so great that you have to have it again. But the product has to not fill you up so that you want more. So when I say set up to fail, I mean almost at a really deep scientific level, you've been set up to fail. And it's cruel, really, isn't it? When you actually look at it, and I thought, yeah, all those, you know, can anyone ever eat one Pringle? Of course they can't. They can only eat the whole tube. And they're made like that. They're made to make you want more, but they don't fill you up. And that's pretty fundamental, and I think that's why people find it so hard.
Yeah, I mean, years ago in my own ups and downs with weight loss, I remember going to like a sort of Slimming World meeting, and I'm just kind of an emotional eater. I eat when I'm happy, I eat when I'm sad, I eat when you know, and all that. And they're like, everyone that's sitting here is an emotional eater. That I'm like, oh yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's like the light goes on. It's like, oh yeah, that's why we're sat here. So there undoubtedly are people that can eat one Pringle, but we're not them, and we're, you know, the people with the weight loss problems are not they. So we talked a little bit about shame. I want to talk a little bit about control as well. Did you feel like you needed to be in control of your weight loss journey?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'd never properly, even though I've literally tried every diet in the world, from the cabbage soup diet to Weight Watchers online to whatever that red and green day was. Yeah, I've done the lot. And it was only when I realised this is actually about forming good behaviours and habits. I actually read a book on Aristotle by Professor Edith Hall, and I kind of realised Aristotle was the first self-help guru, and he created this idea of good habits. And I realised, I think I mentioned this in the book. I actually properly planned for this health journey to the point where, I cleared all the cupboards out. You'll be proud of me as well, Leslie. I didn't just clear everything out. I washed the cupboards. I laid new paper down. I put the things in the right order, which was actually the beginnings of an understanding that there was a sort of declutter element that actually helped me on the journey a little bit as well. And I'm sure we'll discuss this later on. But I couldn't have anything at the back of a cupboard that was vaguely sugary, because as soon as I had too many processed carbohydrates or sugar, my hunger was sort of alarmed again, and I would have a 12-hour need for more sugar even if I just tasted a little bit. So I had to sort of deconstruct where I was failing really deeply, and I realised it started with the fridge and the cupboards, and so I just had to think about what I put in the cupboard. And you talk about comfort eating. It's only years later that I realised, of course, my emotions drove my eating as well as what I thought was sugar addiction. And even now, if I've had a row or I've had a bad day, I feel the need to eat something. But now I'll eat a piece of lean turkey because it's always in the fridge because I've organised the shopping list in the way. And all right, I probably don't need the turkey, but it's definitely better than 3 packets of crisps.
Yeah, and I think that it is important to take things back to first principles. And, with decluttering, I mean, you've listened to all of our podcasts pretty much, Tom. And so you know that we're all about the emotions. And so people focus on the stuff, people focus on the weight loss, I guess, in your instance. And actually, you need to take it right back and say, but what's the why? Why am I doing this? Why am I so emotional? What is it that's driving my behavior and sabotaging what I want for my future life? And how can I fit this into my current life? And as I say, it takes time for some people. Now, for you, it was was it an immediate sort of, I've got to reset everything and start from scratch, and I can't possibly sort of veer off the pathway?
There was definitely a very big fear of failure, because it felt like the last roll of the dice for me. If I'd really committed to this and I'd failed, what am I going to do? And, by the time I got to actually committing, I'd read so much, it started with one of Michael Mosley's books. I read it on a Kindle. Being a little bit obsessive, I then used the footnotes on the Kindle to read the scientific papers. And I realized there was actually a sort of nutritional program that I'd not tried, where recent research had suggested it could really help people with my condition, high blood pressure and problems dealing with blood sugars. And so I'd vested a lot of reading time into it. And I realized what I needed to do was find time in my very busy life. And actually, the first thing I realized was what I actually needed to do was find time for me to do it. And that required negotiation. I had a staff of 17 people, all of which, you could imagine what it was like, sort of frontline politics in a chaotic period in political history. One of the things I needed to do was sort my diary so I could actually do a weekly shop, and I could prepare real food, not microwave food. And so just finding time at the start and the end of the day to cook and do all of that became quite hard. And in the end, it caused quite a lot of tension with my team when I was wedging that space into my weekly diary. But of course, 3 months later, the weight's off. I'm a happier person to work with. I'm actually way more productive. Arguably a much more sort of reasonable colleague to spend time with. And my team were really proud of me. So it worked out. But
it worked well, yeah.
You have to really, work out where you're going to fall. And for me, it was, the first thing was time.
Yeah.
And then when I found the time, I realised I needed to make routines. I realised no day is the same in politics. You kind of get your dopamine high on the chaos and the tension and the pressure and, the variation in your day. I couldn't do that. What I needed was simple daily rules. And this is where Aristotle helped me with laying down habits. So, my morning routine became absolutely central to what I did. trainers by the back door last thing before I went to bed at night. Get up, go to the bathroom, do my daily weigh-in, brew the coffee, and then get out to get my daily steps before the day started. That's when I started listening to the podcast, by the way. I'd listened to a lot of podcasts. And that's where I started to understand the parallels between organising your personal space and organising your personal health were very, very similar. You needed routines and approaches, and you needed to break things down into really small little bits of work and processes in order to succeed over time. And I found that very rewarding as well.
I think it's so interesting because it's like music to my ears, Tom, really, because honestly, everything that you're talking about in your journey is exactly the same as everything that we teach. But I do have one thing that I want to talk to you about, which is you're very well read. Your latest book, you talk about a lot of the research that you have done, the different type of diets that are out there, why they work, why they don't, different things. You don't tell people what to do, but you explain all the different options. So what we find quite often in the decluttering world is obviously there's a lot of information out there about decluttering, and some of them, even though at their core they are very similar, there are more than one way to skin a cat, let's call it that way. And so did you find some of that information that's out there useful, or is that your mind, you like all of the information, make your own judgment on that? Or did you find because they were different and conflicting, because they are in the diet world, it is quite conflicting information sometimes, was that useful or not?
The diet world, there's nearly world wars between nutritionists over you putting yourself. Sometimes the language gets very violent when people fundamentally disagree. In the end, I defined public current government guidelines on what you put in yourself. I take in fewer carbohydrates than the government recommend. But I thought to myself, what have I got to lose? I'm 22 stone with type 2 diabetes, if you don't sort it out. And it worked for me. But I needed to read my way through it to work out there was a rational basis, and there was some research there. And in the end, I guess I'm quite lucky that I've always been able to sort of do that kind of thing. I found myself getting angry on behalf of other people, though, because essentially what I had to do was do my own signposting and work my own route out. And if you're doing shift work on minimum wage, holding a family of three together and, all the usual pressures without the luxuries of a team to support you like I had, it's 10 times harder. And it was flipping hard for me, I'm making it sound easy, but it really, really wasn't in the early months. It was quite painful and debilitating at times. But once you get there, I think once you can work out where you fail and be honest with yourself about it, you're just a little bit kinder than yourself. And then you still fail and you make those mistakes, but it's like you don't give up. You work a way around it. And that's what helped for me. And that's why with the new book, Lose Weight for Life, which is a terrible rod for the back of a 55-year-old bloke, I can't believe I published a book called Lose Weight for Life.
You're not going backwards, are you, in this journey?
It's very humiliating if I do. But the point is, in the first book, I thought I needed to be very candid about all my failures. But I didn't want to lecture people. I just wanted to say what worked for me. But then I got so many letters and emails saying, how did you do? What did you actually do to clean the cupboards out? And, what was your morning routine? And what do you put in your gratitude journal that makes you, reward yourself? This is more of a how-to, it's more of a blueprint. But you've still, just how to write your own blueprint, not copy my blueprint. And that's, but in the end, that's what gets you through. If you can identify the failure and work out a way that you can reset, be kind on yourself when things go wrong. I'm trying to run 50 miles this month to raise some money for the Samaritans. And then I went and had flu for a week and I couldn't run for 10 days. Yeah. 5 years ago, I'd have just given up. Now I've just thought, okay, well, it's not your fault that you've had 10 days taken out of your running life. Just add 10 days on at the end. Yeah. Everyone that sponsored you's got to understand you've had flu. Yeah. It's just a slightly different way, a slightly more positive outlook about how you deal with failure, I think.
Right. I know it is all about being kind to yourself. Rule number one of decluttering is to understand that life throws curveballs your way and that you're not always going to be able to stay on the wagon and things like that. So that's super important. And I'm interested in your daily routines as well. So you talk about your they're almost like what we would consider to be non-negotiables in terms of a morning reset, a tidying. So so they were your non-negotiables and you planned for those. So planning was a big part of it. And it's a big part of what we teach. We're just straight out of a challenge actually a few weeks ago. And the light bulbs that go on when you say to somebody, you can't just suddenly wake up one day and go, I'm going to declutter my living room today. Not as simple as that. There's a lot that has to come before that to understand what's going to set you back beforehand, how to plan, how to prepare, what you need, what you need to set yourselves up for this emotionally, physically, practically. And so just doing all of that preparation work is so critical to people's success. But yet people are like, well, I just thought it was as simple as, well, I just need to declutter my living room and get on with it. But there's so much to it. It's quite deep, you know what I mean? Because this is in the same way as weight loss, decluttering is something that's plagued many people for years, if not decades. And so it needs more work to get to that point where you're like, okay, now I'm ready. I mean, you do need to get there and you do need to take action. Of course you do, but you need to do that careful planning and preparation. That was critical for you then.
The decluttering stuff came after my health journey. And when the lines start to blur, when I look at my life over the last 40 years of adult life, when I left home, I've never had order, right? I've had piles of books everywhere. I've not had a clothes strategy. There was no regularity when you do the cleaning. And there's reasons for that, I'm sure we'll go into, but actually the same principles apply. Like, you want your house clean and tidy and functional, work out where the failures are, work out your little routines. And you and Ingrid, I can't tell you the little tips you've given me, right? The little building blocks of a strategy. I'm not even going to claim I've got a strategy because I'm not that good on decluttering yet. Tiny little things you gave me, right? I could hug you both, right? Well, paper management stuff. You can imagine the life I'm still getting loads of correspondence. You tell me don't keep the envelopes, right? So I reckon I probably binned a ton of envelopes since listening to the first podcast that gave me an envelope management strategy. It's a tiny little thing, but it's a massive deal in you're trying to manage lots of things. And then the other thing you've given me is how to deal with all your Christmas decorations, right? Which, I'm the sort of guy who still has the Christmas tree up in March. Right. But I don't anymore. I've got a little special. Good. I've got a special bag, and I even do the lights, get them wrapped around so they're not all. You don't have to spend 3 hours untangling them. You two gave me that. You've probably given me 5 hours back of Christmas decoration management, right? And this is all about finding little wraparounds with.
Yeah, exactly. And for some people, it's those little, everyone works in a different way and there's different things. So some people like to take it back to basics and go, we have a roadmap in our membership and take it right back to basics if you're living in complete chaos then. And some people, it's just taking little bits of snippets. That's what the podcast is great at, little snippets of information. And it is always things that you've never thought of. And so quite often when we do a 10 Things podcast, it's things that people have never thought about before, but we've seen it a million times, obviously in houses. They're like, oh yeah, that's me. And the light bulbs go on. Yeah, I need to change that and so on.
I'll tell you the other thing gave me. When I asked myself, will I ever have a video cassette player that plays VHS tapes or even DVDs ever again? And the answer was a resounding no. That cleared a whole shelf in a back room that will never ever have been used again. To the charity shop because some people still use it. Just those little elemental, just slightly deeper questions that you ask yourself when you're sorting these things out. And you really help on that. You're the only two, your podcast gave me all these little things.
Brilliant. So we're going to go to a break, Tom. You've already alluded to the fact that you lived your life in chaos, in your words. And so after the break, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into why that might be.
Do you listen to our podcast week after week and think to yourself, I wish I could ask Ingrid or Leslie about something that relates to me, my home, and my situation. I would love a chance to delve deep into a clutter issue that's been stalling me in my decluttering journey. Well, that time has come. For July only, we are offering a one-to-one declutter power-up call with one of us for 50% off our normal price. Spaces are limited, so be quick. Go to declutterhub.com/powerup and use the coupon code POWER50.
Okay, Tom. So we talked a little bit about your weight loss journey, well, quite a lot about your weight loss journey before the break. And you alluded to the fact that you felt that you would live your early life in chaos. Yeah, you had no order. And then about 18 months ago, you had another little curveball thrown your way. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Basically, 18 months ago, I had a formal diagnosis of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which was more of a confirmation of something I kind of knew I probably had, or at least had thought I had for about a decade, or maybe a bit longer. But to formally find out that I have a neurological condition that has made some things harder for me to do in life, had some quite dramatic impacts. But to actually get to that diagnosis, it was actually the health journey that helped me get there, because when I changed my nutrition and got healthy, one of the benefits I didn't realize would happen was I felt like I'd got a greater clarity of thinking. I described it as like a brain fog lifting from my head, almost like my IQ went up. And I just found a little bit more bandwidth to think a little bit more deeply about sequencing organizational tasks. And so I do think there's a link between nutrition and ADHD. And in the end, having read a piece by Adrian Charles in The Guardian where he talked about how he'd got a diagnosis of ADHD, I literally thought, well, I could have written this op-ed, and now's the time to sort that out. And it started yet another journey in trying to understand myself and some of the mistakes I've made in life and how I can overcome some of the hurdles, because obviously two of the hardest things for people with ADHD to do are manage their time, because there's a thing called time blindness where small tasks you overestimate how long it takes to do small tasks and you underestimate how long it takes to do big tasks. And also organisation is obviously not great if you're not focused on it. And so anything to do with organising clothes, possessions, cleaning rotas, tidying a house has always been profoundly challenging for me.
So you talked about the fact that you feel that the signs were there. So how do you feel that the signs were there for the previous 10 years? And what was it that suddenly made you think, you know, so it was the article that you read, but what did you think prior to that then?
I'd got friends with ADHD who, and the weird thing is once you get a diagnosis, you can kind of spot traits in other people, but it's a little bit rude to go to people and say, by the way, I think you've got ADHD. And so over the years, you know, friends had given gentle words. I remember I've got a very close friend whose daughter had got a diagnosis, and there's a sort of a preliminary test you do that talks about how you deal with particular tasks. And he said, fill out these boxes and see how you do on this test. And I got halfway through and couldn't finish it because I was distracted. But even doing that, it was pretty clear I got ADHD. And it was quite funny at the time, but I never did anything about it. And actually, there's a lot of people who, you know, now in adulthood, now the condition is more understood, are taking what's quite a big thing and getting formally diagnosed, because you're admitting that your brain is wired in a different way to most people's. You're not neurotypical, but once you realise it's, you know, things you've done are not necessarily your fault, you've just got difficulty doing certain tasks that other people find easy, you end up with a lot of, you know, you look back on events in life and think, you know, could I have done things differently had I known I, you know, got techniques for dealing with this condition. And for me, you know, it became a really deep sort of sense of who I was. It was this idea that I always used to say that I'm the hardest working, laziest person I know, because I was always in chaos. There was, you know, surrounded by piles of paper and books and, you know, projects that were not quite complete or ongoing, and multiple, I always had 4 books by the side of the bed because I could never decide which chapter I was going to read before sleep. And it led to this sense that I never actually finished anything, which of course is one of the things that ADHD can do. And what I've realised, of course, looking back, what I can do is build teams. And I was in a fortunate position that I had jobs where I was asked to assemble teams, and I'd almost unconsciously always tried to pair myself up with someone who was very, very good at completing tasks and finishing tasks, and built very strong working relationship with teams of people who were very different to me. And so you realise that in life, if you can work out ways to deal with these problems, you kind of put an external scaffolding around yourself for people who can support your deficiencies. But even when you get the diagnosis, it's kind of, for me, it was slightly overwhelming, and I had not really prepared myself for that. There were lots of, childhood memories. I always remember that. It still comes back to me, this memory, so it must be quite traumatic at the time. I used to share a locker with Stephen Wharton when I was 9 years old. He's my best friend from school, and his half of the locker was always very tidy, and mine was always like a total mess. PE kit I've not taken home for my mum to wash and all that kind of stuff. And for the second time in a month, I lost my maths book, and I remember Mrs. Green shouting at me and me being so scared and embarrassed that, why do I keep losing these books? That I didn't want to go to school that day, and I was really emotionally challenged by it. It's only a tiny little thing, but of course that was, as I was entering adolescence, that's when ADHD sort of manifests itself. It was pretty obvious back then, and I would probably have been, identified as someone who perhaps should have had a test in childhood, if the condition was known more about in the late 70s, early 80s. So you kind of wonder, how would my life have unfolded had I had a diagnosis earlier?
Yeah, because it is all about strategies, I guess. Masking is a big thing, isn't it, with ADHD as well? And I know a lot of women my age are getting late diagnoses of ADHD at the moment. And Sarah Bickers, who's a good friend of hers, who's, she's done a couple of podcasts from the Declutter Hub. She's done something within our membership as well. She talks about, because it's no secret that when Ingrid and I talk on the podcast, she's the kind of one that keeps us on task, and I'm the one that's airy-fairy, got flying off to the next thing. And so, she said a very interesting thing, because sometimes I go, oh, maybe, do you know what I mean? And then, but she's like, but really, it's a thing if it's affecting your life. Is it affecting your life in anxiety or not turning up to things or relationships or anything like that? And the truth of that is it is not. So do I have that kind of brain that flits off to other things that's quite sort of moving on? Yes, I do. Is that ADHD? I doubt it very much, because it does not affect my life. It affects Ingrid a lot. she affects Ingrid's life, and she's like, please don't do that, Leslie. But I think that's really interesting to understand that, because a lot of the, when people are talking about ADHD, a lot of people, oh, well, I do that. Oh, well, I go into a room and I forget what I went in for. Oh, I do that, and I'm late for things. And do you know what I mean? And it's when it becomes a little bit more, not catastrophic, but a bit more impactful then. That's where the signs are. Not that I'm an ADHD specialist, of course, but ADHD is a big part of the world of decluttering, do you know what I mean? And becoming more prevalent as more and more people are getting these diagnoses. And it's important for people to have a reason and then to build those strategies. And so, it needs to be part of the solution, in my opinion. I think it's like, okay, well, I know that now. So what kind of strategy can I build to try and do that in a different way? And so what kind of strategies have you started to build then, Tom? I mean, obviously the organizational side of things started as part of your weight loss journey, and now you've had your ADHD diagnosis. You want to move into kind of home organization and strategies for tidying and things like that. So what sort of things have you done?
Well, I've got to say, I couldn't write a book on home organization yet. So I'm nowhere near as far down the journey of understanding that, which is why I love your podcast so much, because I learn from you. But the techniques that I use to start my journey in health are the same in this. So the first is, how do I manage my time? And actually, when I left politics, my scheduling collapsed, and I realized what I needed to do was just have a little bit of help scheduling my professional and private life. Of course, everything collapsed, and you're doing Zoom calls and you're trying to fit everything in. What I do in my daily schedule, this is where I think your listeners might begin to think I'm a little bit cranky and eccentric. Now that I know I've got ADHD, and that means that doing repetitive, sometimes what some people would say boring tasks are harder to motivate yourself to do. I break the day and I have these little bite-sized chunks of 15 minutes that I call boring time. And I play this little game with myself where I say, it doesn't matter what you do in that 15 minutes, but you've got to be doing something to get the house in better shape. So, literally I could do 2 minutes of washing up and only do half the washing up, but I've done some of it. And then I'll take the towels up and put them in the airing cupboard. And then I'll throw all my envelopes away from the day's post.
Well done.
It's not quite as organised. It's probably not the best use of my time, but it gets 2 or 3 tasks done that I wouldn't ordinarily do naturally unless I specifically organised my day and committed to doing that little bit of time. And the other thing I realised is, of course, my circumstances changed when I left Parliament. So most of my week was in a 1-bedroom flat on my own in London. And I realised that, I had order in the flat I was in because I wasn't sharing the space with anyone. It was just me. And so everything had a place. And when I left politics, I'm with my new partner and her kids. And what you realise is there's a massive negotiation over use of space, over prioritising domestic tasks, shared work, possessions that have different values to different people in the house. And that's the bit I haven't worked out yet. And that's still like a negotiation and reaching an understanding. And, that's why I think I'm going to be listening to the podcast for another 3 years, because that's going to take...
So, yeah, exactly. So you obviously love a reset, Tom, and we love a reset here at the Declutter Hub. And actually, you call it a reset in your latest book that I read, devoured actually last weekend. So talk a little bit about the book, or any books. You have a number of books, don't you?
Well, that's kind of you to say, Leslie. My new book is called Lose Weight for Life, and it comes on the back of my first health and wellbeing book called Downsizing, which surprised me the most, that it was actually a Sunday Times bestseller, because it talked about the journey I went on to reverse type 2 diabetes and lose 8 stone. But the publishers had a lot of emails and letters, and I've had hundreds of emails and letters from people who say, I read your book, I'm in the same place, I was in denial about my house, but how did you actually do it? How did you clean out your cupboards? What did you put in your fridge? What did you write in your gratitude journal? And so there was a sort of sense that I needed to, I told my story about how I did it. I didn't want to preach to people, but the new book, Lose Weight for Life, is really a blueprint for how I did it. And it gives people sort of tips and tricks for reassessing how you can go on your own health journey. And I hope people find it of use. And also there's little things in it. There's a few recipes at the back that really helped me when I was changing my nutrition to take sugar out of my diet and introduce more healthy, nutrient-dense food. So there's things like making a thing called cauliflower rice, which sounds really weird, but it replaces rice and it's really great. And but how you do that is a little tricky because people aren't used to doing that very often.
Perfect. So where can people find the book, Tom?
It's in all good bookshops. The publishers tell me that it's also going to be stocked in Sainsbury's, so if you're doing your weekly shop, you can buy the book on the bookshelves in Sainsbury's, and you can get it in Waterstones and Amazons and all the other bookshops as well.
And will it be, because obviously we've got a global audience, will it be available outside of the UK as well?
It will be. I'm not quite sure if it's launched, if there's a slight delay in that, but yes, it's a global, it's globally available. So, and if anyone lives in a country where they can't find it, find me on the internet and email me, and I'll make sure you get a copy.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I absolutely loved it, everybody. I thought it was fantastic. I couldn't put it down. So, and the Downsizing one, which is the first book as well. So Downsizing and Lose Weight for Life, 2 fantastic books by Tom.
Thanks, Leslie.
I'm absolutely loving this interview, Tom, because I just feel like everything that you're saying is going to resonate so much, whether it's your ADHD strategies that you've started to build, whether it's the organisation that started that weight loss journey, the parallels between decluttering, organising and weight loss, the transformation that you've undergone, the fact that your well-being is so much better, the fact that you're moving forward. It's all such amazingly positive stuff. Now, I know when we chatted about the podcast, you were like, oh, and I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about this. And I was like, geez, that's like a 2-hour podcast. And there's so many things. You've just talked about moving in with your partner and her children. I think that's a whole life-changing experience for you. I know you've got some questions. And so what I'd like to do, if this is okay with you, is I would like to end this lovely podcast about your journey so far. And then we will go into another podcast, which will broadcast in a few weeks' time, all about your ongoing journey from here. How does that sound?
I'd love that. Because I've got lots of questions I want to ask you, Leslie.
I know this is the thing. So how do we do this? I feel like, you're an accomplished interviewer and interviewee. So why don't we turn the tables on the Declutter Hub podcast and you can ask me the questions? Okay. And I hope that I can answer them in the way that you've answered
If I told you that I'm completely renovating a new house, a very old house, and so it's like we started with an empty house from scratch, and I want to build up routines from there. So I've got a million questions I want to ask you about that. So if you could help me do that, that would be fantastic.
Let's do it. It sounds fab. And I'm excited to be interviewed. I'm excited. So I've loved it. Thank you so much, Tom, for your time today. Can't wait to come back in a few weeks' time. So look out for, I'm going to say episode 203. You will be in our 200th plus podcast. Tom, can you believe we've hit 200 podcasts? Is that 200 times you've listened to us? It's like scary.
But you've put in so much work. I mean, you've helped so many people, Leslie and Ingrid. But you must be proud of what you do.
Yeah, no, we are proud and we love the podcast. Yeah, sometimes we go completely off track. Today, I've tried to stay on track. And so thank you so much for your time, Tom. Let's think about next week and what's coming next week. Next week, we're going back to basics again. And we are talking about packing your suitcase for your holidays. And so if you're going away, you're going to need to know how to pack your suitcase. So do join us next week for some handy hints and tips. Thank you so much, Tom. And we'll see you in another few podcasts time.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks so much for listening to the Declutter Hub podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us in your podcast player so you don't miss an episode, and we'll see you next week.